It's a brand new year. I'm super excited about the current state of React and the direction that React is going in. I'm also very excited about this channel and the direction that it's going in. And to make it special for the first video on the channel in this new year, I want to give you the complete guide to modern React in 2025. Essentially, what I want for this video to be is to be a general overview of all the different concepts and things that you should know as a React developer going into this new year and kind of give you a sort of roadmap to follow so that you have something to do for this new year. You have all the things that you should know about, be familiar with, and all of this with the hopes and goals of making you a better React developer. So whether you're a junior developer that's maybe just starting out with React, or you're an intermediate developer and you already have some experience with it, or even if you're a senior developer, you are going to learn something in this video. And speaking of becoming a better React developer, if you haven't heard, I have a newsletter. It's called Import React. It's completely free and you can use it to stay up to date with everything that is going on in the React world and also get tips and tricks and really cool stuff about React that you can't find anywhere else. Once again, it's completely free and I'm going to leave a link for you in the description if you're interested. And now let's talk about modern React in 2025. All right, cool. So let's begin the overview. Let's begin the guide. Now, first, we have to kind of understand two very important concepts in React. That is going to be, let's make here a square. That is going to be the concept of a client and also the concept of a server, right? So in modern React, now we have kind of two Reacts that we need to think about. We have the client-side React, which is everything that happens in the client in the user's browser. And then we have the server-side React, which runs on servers that you deploy that then have logic in your React code that actually runs in a server environment. And this is very important because as we're going into 2025 and beyond, now we always have to think about these two environments whenever we're building our React applications. So understanding what the client is and what the client should do and what it's responsible with is very important, but also understanding the server, how it works and what it's responsible for is also very important. So I want to first start by really understanding what the client and the server is, listing some things that belong to each environment, and then from that I'm going to give you some things that you should know about and be familiar with as you work with React in both of these environments. Now I do want to make a disclaimer that even though we have the client and the server, the reality of the world is that currently most of the React projects that you're going to find in the real world, which means most of the projects that you're going to end up working in as a software developer, are going to be mostly client focused. Even though we have all of this new cool server functionality, a lot of the projects still run entirely on client-side application, and that's just because things move slow in the real world. You have a lot of companies with a lot of code, they have legacy code, and it's very slow and difficult for them to move to these new APIs. Even if they're better, even if they offer better performance, the cost of moving all of that code is just too much and it is going to take a little bit of time until they actually get there. So just keep that in mind. As cool as the server is, as cool as all of these new APIs and things that the server allows us to do is, the reality is that a lot of the React world is still going to be client focused. And that's also what I kind of want to focus my channel on because that is just the reality. That's what you are going to be working in. And my job as this YouTube channel is to prepare you for the real world. Cool. So let's talk now about the client. So in the client, whenever we're talking about the client, usually what we're talking about is we're talking about something that we call the JS bundle. That is going to be the JavaScript bundle, essentially the JavaScript that you end up shipping to the user on the browser, and that essentially builds and runs your entire React application. So we're going to put here ships to browser because really that's what happens. You ship the bundle to the browser, the user downloads the bundle, and there is no React application without this JavaScript bundle, right? And this all happens in the client. When you think about the server, there is no JavaScript bundle, right? The JavaScript bundle is only on the client and it's because the user has to download it and run it on their browser. Now, because the JavaScript bundle is essentially JavaScript, it then allows us to do JavaScript things, like, for example, interactivity, right? Interactivity, things like clicking a button, typing on an input, responding to some sort of event, right? Putting on change, on submit, all of these events, these require interactivity, and so they are on the client, right? So I can put in here, event handlers, right? This is all possible because we have JavaScript, and only with JavaScript can we respond to events and then handle user interactions. And this handles completely on the client. We also have the concept, because we are working in React, we work a lot with hooks, right? Hooks, so like use state or use effect. These, again, are all hooks that can only be possible on the client. When you take this specific case of use state, for example, right, you have state that can be dynamic, that can change over time, that can cause a component to re-render. This can only happen on the client. You have no concept of state, of re-renders, of effects on the server. The server is a completely different environment, and the things that work on the client do not apply on the server. Now, usually, whenever we're talking about the client, we're also talking about something that we call SPA, or single page application. A single page application is essentially an application that all runs within a single page, which means that the browser does not reload to actually get a new page. Because we're running everything in JavaScript, first the user needs to download the JavaScript, and then on that same page, without a separate reload, the JavaScript is going to run all of its code. It is going to mount all of your components, run all of your functions and your hooks, and it is going to build the actual application, but within the same page. No page reload is going to happen in terms of the browser, right? Everything happens on a single page, and so we call that a single page application. And single page applications are essentially all that React was for many, many years. It initially started as a single page application type of library, right? Only later on did we start introducing more server-centric concepts like server-side rendering and even now server components, but these all belong on the server side. You need the server to run these things. If you don't have a server, you can still have a React application. You can still have a very rich interactive React application, but it is only going to run on the client as a single page application. And single page applications usually leads to something that we call client-side routing. Client-side routing, right? Because in our applications, we usually want to have more than one page, which means the user can ideally navigate to different pages. The URL can change to reflect those pages. But since we're still running in a single page application, all of that happens on the JavaScript side. And again, we're not reloading anything in the browser. We're just changing the JavaScript and changing the browser, which the JavaScript can do as the user is navigating in our application. But this all happens client side, no page reload is happening. And that is what we call client-side routing. And then we have a very important concept that has always been important, but now is even more important because now we're going to see how that differs on the server. That is going to be the concept of fetch as you render. So fetch as you render essentially means that if you have some sort of data fetching in your application, right, you have an asynchronous function that fetches data from an API or something, which a lot of React applications do, that fetch can only happen after the JavaScript bundle has been downloaded by the user and your components mounted, right? Because if your entire application lives in this JavaScript bundle, the user has to first download the entire bundle, which can take some time, especially if it's a slower connection. Then that bundle has to actually run, and then you're going to have your application be built, your components be mounted, and depending on the amount of components, that could also take some time. And only once you have your components mounted and everything is ready, then can you trigger a fetch request to happen, usually in a use effect, or if you're using something like React Query. The important part is here that you have to fetch as you render, which means you need to wait for a render to happen before you can even begin the fetch. And then the fetch is going to take some time, and that is going to eventually return to your response. But that all has to happen after the JavaScript bundle has been downloaded. This is a very important concept. So now let's move on to the server side of things and let's see how the server behaves. So in the server side, what I'm going to put here is, I'm going to put it because it's important, I'm going to put no JavaScript bundle. In terms of the server, when it comes to the server, there is no JavaScript bundle, right? All of the JavaScript in a server environment will actually run exclusively on the server environment and will never make it to the user. The only thing that makes it to the user is the actual HTML that is going to be as a result of the JavaScript that you run. And I'm going to put here an arrow, the HTML is going to go to the user, not the JavaScript. And this is really important because now if your JavaScript only runs on the server, you're not sending a big bundle to the client. The client doesn't have to download a big bundle. You can run a lot of code on the server. You can pull a lot of dependencies that might be expensive, and you never have to ship those to the client. The only thing that you end up shipping is the actual HTML, which is not going to be that big, right? The HTML is just a markup that is going to be the result of your JavaScript, and all that you do is you send that to the user, and then the user gets a better user experience because it's faster and they immediately see your application faster. And because all of this JavaScript only ever runs on the server and does not run on the client, that means that we cannot have any interactivity, right? Because interactivity requires JavaScript to run in a browser environment, and that just doesn't happen on the server. So we're going to put here no interactivity. This also means that we have no concept of hooks. So we're going to put here no hooks, right? We have no concept of useState. We have no concept of useEffect. We have no concept of re-rendering a component. These are all client-side things. On the server, you still have components, as we're going to see with server components, but they don't re-render. They are just there to be executed once to then produce some HTML. And then we just send that HTML to the user, and that is it. Now, to do all of this, of course, I've just mentioned it, we have a few options. For example, we have server components. Server components, as the name implies, they are React components. So they look exactly like React components, right? They are essentially functions and you can put values in them. And then you can return JSX, which is going to ultimately be converted to the HTML that we sent to the browser. And these components, the only difference that they have to normal React components is that they run exclusively on the server and never make it to the client. This also means that these components, because they run on the server, they can be async components, which means that you can use the await keyword inside of the component, and you can actually await some data before you return the HTML and build the HTML and return it to the actual user. Because it runs in a server environment, you can have asynchronous calls inside of it, and then you can just return the data once the calls are executed. You cannot do this on a client-side application because the concept just doesn't apply. This is a server environment and the client is completely different and it's a client environment. We also have things like SSR or SSG or partial pre-rendering, right? These are all concepts that I don't want to go too in depth in this video, but essentially server-side rendering, SSR, is something that we've had for many years in React, which was the concept of running a component both on the server and then also on the client. And usually we would do that for SEO benefits, right? Because if you're shipping a JavaScript bundle to the user, in terms of SEO, what you're actually shipping initially is the raw HTML, which usually, if I can come in here, had something like a div and an ID of root, right? How many of us have this in React applications? That's like the standard. And then once the JavaScript bundle loads, then it would actually go and come into this div ID root and then build your entire application. The problem for SEO is that the SEO on initial page load only sees this div ID root. It doesn't see anything else. And so it has no concept of what your application is about, right? So server-side rendering was a way to run some components in the server first, generate some HTML, send that HTML so that this becomes a little bit more rich, and then run the JavaScript afterwards and then hydrate the component. We're going to get the hydration in just a moment. Static site generation is essentially when you generate your website statically, which means you run the server components and all of that and you generate the HTML, but you do that at build time. Usually you do that for pages that don't really expect to update that often, like a blog article or some sort of about page, right? Static pages, right? If you have more dynamic pages, maybe you opt for server-side rendering or just server components altogether, because those can be dynamic. And then partial pre-rendering is a little bit more of an advanced concept. Essentially means that you can split your page into multiple parts. Some parts you render statically on the server, some parts are dynamic, so you render them on the client, and then you kind of just mix all of that together, and you essentially render things as you have them available, whether they come from the server or whether they come from the client. Now, we also have the concept of hydration, which I talked about just now. And hydration simply is the action of taking the raw HTML that we generate from a server component, however, and then sending along some JavaScript with it to hydrate that component and make it interactive, right? Because we said on a server environment, there's no interactivity, there's no hooks, but that doesn't mean that interactivity is bad or that hooks are bad, right? After all, React is an interactive library. It makes us build interactive applications. Interactivity is good. You want users to be able to click buttons on your application. You want hooks to be able to handle the state of those buttons and of those events. But ideally, you want to combine the server and the client in a way that makes sense and that is efficient. And that is essentially what hydration does. So if you take a framework like Next.js, for example, you run a server component, that component is going to run on the server, and the server component might have other components, child components, that are client components. You can have that. You can mix components in between. Some components can be server, some components can be client. And then what happens is you render everything on the server first, and then you send the JavaScript in the background. The user doesn't see this. And then the JavaScript goes and attaches itself to the components that it needs, which means use state, event handlers, and so on. And that is what we call hydration. We're hydrating the raw HTML that is not interactive, and we're making it interactive with JavaScript in the process that we call hydration. And then if you're using server components, we now have this concept of a client boundary. So I'm going to put boundaries here. Client boundaries are essentially lines that you define in your applications that you can say from this moment onwards and everywhere beyond, we are now going to cross over the boundary, over the line into the client environment. And usually the way that you do that is by using the use client directive. So we're going to do client like this, the use client directive, right? If you work with Next.js, this is what you do. So what happens here is when you put this at the top of the file, then that file and everything that it imports, and that is very important, has now crossed over the client boundary. So if I can come here and can I just put a line? Yes, I can do a line. We're going to do a line over here. That is going to be the client boundary. Whenever you put use client on the top of a file, that file and everything that it imports has now crossed over to the client, and there is no going back. That is very important because again, the client and the server are completely separate environments and they function completely differently, which means that once you cross over from the server to the client, you cannot go back. So if you put this at the top of your file, that file and everything that it imports is going to go on the client. That also means that if you have this on the client and you're importing stuff from the server components and stuff like that, you are bringing those over across the boundary into the client environment. So even if a client component imports a server component, that server component is then going to automatically become a client component because you cannot have a server component live in a client environment. You cross the boundary once, you cross it with the use client, and then that's it. There's no going back. The file and everything that it imports is forever going to be on the client. And this is really important to know and to understand as a React developer, because now you have to make decisions as to where that boundary is going to be. On which components is it going to be? Which components are you going to put on the server? Which are you going to put on the client, right? Do you need to fetch some data on the server? Can you do it on the server and just send the HTML? Or do you need to have some sort of interactivity, button clicks, or even infinite loading of data, and you want to do that on a client? Putting this client boundary here is as much of an art as it is a skill, and you need to understand the nuances between that to become a great React developer. And finally, we have one more concept that I want to talk about on the server, and that is going to be the opposite of fetch as you render. That is going to be render as you fetch. And this one is extremely important, and understanding the differences between the render as you fetch and fetch as you render is the key to becoming an advanced React developer. So render as you fetch, right, is the opposite of fetch as you render. In fetch as you render, we had to wait for the JavaScript bundle to load before we can even begin fetching. That's why we're fetching as we're rendering stuff. But in the case of render as you fetch, we can actually render data as we're fetching it and as it becomes available. And this is only possible because we're using server components, and we can now await data. We can fetch data directly in the component, and then we can render that data. We can render that component, that HTML, as soon as the data is available. No longer do we have to wait for a JavaScript bundle to load before fetching our data. We can fetch our data directly at the same time as the user is requesting the component. And this is huge because first of all, it's faster, it's more performant, right? Waiting for a JavaScript bundle is not fast, right? If the user has a slow connection, that's not going to be a good experience. If we're doing things on the server, we're fetching data directly on the server, and then we're not even shipping a JavaScript bundle, we're only shipping the data as we have it, that is going to be a lot more performant. So understanding these two concepts, how they differ, how they're opposites, is really important. And now you have something to look for if you're not familiar with these concepts. I'm telling you, you must understand these concepts as you start to work more on the server side and the client side and combine them together. And they are very important concepts. Cool. Now we kind of covered the important concepts on both the client and the server. And I really hope that you understand that we actually need both to build really great applications. And the server is not here to replace the client, but it's there to enhance the client and to offload some of the stuff that the client had to do to ultimately provide a better user experience for the user, which is ultimately what all of our goals as React developers should be. So now what I want to do is kind of go over some of the popular tools, libraries, and frameworks that are kind of the standard in building client-side and server-side applications so that you know about them, so that you have kind of a list of things to learn if you don't know about them, and just to see kind of what goes where and what relates to what. So on the client side, we talked a lot about fetching data, right? And usually to fetch data on the client side, you would use something called React Query. React Query, to put it simply, is an asynchronous state management solution, but really most of the things you're going to be using it with is actually fetching data, right? Instead of handling your own loading states, instead of fetching data inside of useEffect, you would use React Query and it would do all of that for you and more. It has very good caching support, so it caches all of your data as you're fetching it. It has cool functionalities like background refetching, and it essentially does all the work for you. So if you're not using it and you're doing all the work yourself, look into that because it is the standard and it is a better solution. And I do want to say that you don't have to use React Query specifically. You can use something like SWR, you can use something like Redux Toolkit, and there are many others, right, that you can use. The concept remains the same. Use something that fetches your data for you and manages your asynchronous state, right, state that lives on the server in a database somewhere, and that manages that for you automatically. Then when it comes to client-side routing, I would mention here two very popular libraries that you should look at. The first one is going to be the standard React Router, but I'm only going to put it here as a library because now it became a framework, and we're going to look at that because I'm also going to put it on the server. And then you're also going to have TanStack Router, which is a new kit on the block. It is made by the same people that also made React Query. It's part of TanStack, right? So here we also have, if I can maybe just see it here, React Query is going to be TanStack React Query, right? Right, it's part of the same. It has really nice integrations with React Query, and I would highly recommend checking it out because it kind of shifts a little bit your perspective as to where your data is going to load and how you can actually provide data to your routes super efficiently, and also manage UL parameters and everything that is kind of related to this concept of data fetching and then rendering client-side routing. And fun fact, because you watched this far into the video, I'm actually working on an advanced patterns course, which I'm really super excited about. If you've taken Project React or you know about Project React, this course is like honestly 10 times more complex and more advanced. It's specifically tailored to intermediate developers, and we're using TanStack Router, and it unlocks so many new possibilities, so many cool new patterns that we can use, and all of those are covered in a course, which I'm super excited about. So that's why I mentioned it here, and also that's why I mentioned the course, something to look forward to. And then another library that is usually very important for us to kind of know and keep in mind, that is going to be React Hook Form. React Hook Form is a library that makes forms super easy. It makes having client-side rich interactive forms with client-side validation. So as you type something, it validates everything, and it makes that whole process super easy. And just like React Query, it kind of manages a lot of the stuff for you so that you don't have to manage it. And I want to put here an honorable mention. I want to mention here Zod, because Zod kind of goes hand in hand with React Query, with React Hook Form. Zod is a validation library. It's a schema validation library. You define your schema, it automatically gives you the types for the schema if you're working in TypeScript, and you can directly plug it with one line in React Hook Form, and then your entire form is validated based on that schema. Look into it, it's pretty cool, and I don't really build client-side forms without it nowadays. Then on the server side, well, let's talk about the elephant in the room. We're going to talk about Next.js. So Next.js is the most popular React framework. I believe it's currently recommended as the first position in the official React documentation. So that should tell you kind of how popular this is. Next.js is, as of right now, and it's not going to be for long, but it is the best and arguably the only way to really use all of these new server-side APIs in React, right? If you're trying to use server components and stuff like that outside of React, it's really difficult right now. And if it is possible, I'm not sure exactly if it is, but if it is possible, it is cumbersome. And Next.js, they're just enabled by default, so you don't really have to do anything, and you directly have server components and all these new functionalities in your React application. So if you want to play around with all these new cool APIs, definitely check out Next.js. Then we also have in here, we have, as I said, we have React Router, but here I'm going to put it as a framework. So React Router as a framework is actually React Router, I believe, starting from V7, right? It got released, I think, a couple of weeks ago, and it is a competitor to Next.js in the sense that it also allows you to do server components and all that cool stuff in an alternative way than using Next.js. I know I said that you couldn't do it without Next.js, but I just realized React Router is the new kid on the block, and it allows you to do that. I would highly recommend that you play around with this. I haven't yet, but it is on my to-do list because it offers so many new cool things, so many new cool APIs, and different ways of thinking about your React applications. You also have 10-stack start, right? And you can kind of see like a little bit of teams forming on, right? You have the 10-stack stack, you have the React Router stack, you have the Next.js stack, and they're all competing for essentially developers to use them. 10-stack start, as you could probably imagine, comes from the same people that built 10-stack Router and 10-stack React Query, and it is their framework, right? So kind of like React Router, it is a framework that allows you to do all of these cool server-side things, but also integrates very nicely with 10-stack Router and 10-stack React Query. It is still in beta at the time of filming this video, so I would just play around with it, not ship this to production, but keep an eye on this because I feel that this is going to be a very big player because of how neatly it integrates with React Query and React Router, which are libraries that are used by so many React developers. I think like half React developers actually use React Query, which is insane. And then the last honorable mention on the server side things would be Conform. So Conform is kind of the server-side equivalent of React Hook Form, right? React Hook Form only works on the client because it has hooks, it has interactivity. But when you do things on the server, you kind of lose that interactivity because you're on the server. Conform is a library that tries to bridge those two elements together. It has a very similar API to React Hook Form. It looks to be the same quality. And essentially what it does is it allows you to have all of the server-side functionality of server actions and running all of that on the server while still not compromising on the client-side interactivity and validating everything with Zod and getting everything that we've been used to on the client side. I would look into this. It's on my to-do list to also look into. I haven't had the chance yet, but it looks very promising and I'm very excited to see where this goes this year and beyond. And finally, I also want to end this video by talking about React 19, which is also going to be very important this year. So we're going to put your React 19. So React 19 got released at the end of last year, at the end of 2024, and it brought with it a lot of these cool APIs that are now official and mainstream, if you will. And there's a couple of things here that I want to mention about React 19 that I find are very important outside of everything else that we've mentioned in the server environment. So first we have here use action state. This is a new hook from React, which essentially allows you to have a server action, right, that lives exclusively on the server, right? It becomes a sort of endpoint that you make a request to, but you call it as a function in your code. And it is going to actually return some state. Your function is going to return some state, and that state is going to then go in this hook on the client because it is a hook, which means it has to be on the client. That way you can actually do stuff with server actions. You can update state as your server action is happening, and use action state is going to rerender the component as that happens. This is a cool new API, and it's essentially a new way to build forms. And I believe Conform is using this use action state to handle their forms, which is really, really interesting. So I would look into that. I would play around with use action state because it makes a lot of sense, and it is going to be a very important hook. Then I also want to mention use, which is a new hook from React 19 that essentially allows you to do two things. So first of all, it allows you to consume a context a little bit differently. Instead of using use context, you can now use, and it's a little bit simpler. But it also allows you to consume promises. So promises, right? If you're awaiting some data, you're making a fetch request, you can actually create that promise in a component and then not await it and then pass the promise through props to another component and then consuming using the use custom hook. Not custom hook, but the use hook. And this is really, really interesting. Again, disclaimer, I haven't used this. I haven't played around with this, but based off of what I've seen, it actually offers developers a different way to pass around promises, and I think it could lead to some very interesting architectural decisions in your React applications. So look into how you can now use a context, but specifically look into promises and passing promises around. And also, if you're using React Query, I believe they have support for this now. Look into that because it looks to be very interesting. Then we have suspense, which is a component, and I'm just going to put it here as a component because I think it'll be a little bit more clear. Suspense is a component that we've had in React for a couple of versions now, I believe, but is now ever more so important because it essentially allows us to bridge things between the server and the client. So suspense is a component that essentially suspends the rendering of another component of its children until something becomes available. So simply put, if you have a server component, it's awaiting some data, you can wrap it in suspense, and then that component is not going to render. It is not going to block the rest of the application from rendering until that data is there. If you've been following around in the React 19 news, you probably know that this has caused a big delay in React. That's why React 19 released so late, because they had some issues with the inner workings of suspense and it took some time for them to figure it out. I would look into this hook a lot more. I would use it, play around with it, understand fundamentally how it works, because it is going to be ever so increasingly important now that we have both client and server environments in React. And finally, I left the best for last, and honestly, I really did. We have the React compiler, which at the time of filming this video is still in beta, but I expect that it's going to change at some point. And honestly, I've shipped this in production already and it's been fine. A lot of people also have done. The React compiler is essentially the thing that unlocks us from having to use memo, use callback, memo, and any of our components. The React compiler is going to do all of that for us with a caveat. The caveat, and I'm going to put it here, is that we have to follow the rules of hooks in React. And I'm going to make here an arrow, and we have to follow the rules of hooks in React. So if you've been watching my videos for a while, you know that I talk about the rules of React, right? In React, there are specific rules, specific things that you should or should not do. And I'm very strict about actually teaching you to do them correctly. And the reason why is because of things like this, the rules of hooks. So what happens is the React compiler is going to go through all of your code and is essentially going to memorize everything for you automatically. But it can only do that if every single one of your components actually follows the rules of hooks. If you have a component that does not follow the rules of hooks, maybe you break some rule, maybe you forgot to put a dependency in your use effect or something like that, it will bail out of actually compiling that component until you actually fix that rule that you've broken and you follow the rules of hooks. And I've heard stories of a lot of developers, they want to use the React compiler, they're super excited, and then they put it in their application and they get all of these errors and essentially none of their components are actually compiled because they broke every single rule of hook in every single component. That is not a good experience and I don't want that for you. That's why in my videos, I always am strict about following the rules of hooks and of teaching you how the rules of hooks actually work. And I'm very proud to say that in the project that I've implemented these things in, the compiler just worked across the board in every single component. We have this in the advanced patterns course. We're using the React compiler and we have no issues with it because every single component by default just follows the rules of hooks. It's not that hard. If you understand React and how it actually works fundamentally, it's super easy to follow the rules of hooks because they become natural. And then you apply the React compiler and it does everything for you and you never have to think twice and you don't have to suffer. So if you watch my video, if you take my courses, rest assured, you are following the rules of hooks. I cannot speak for other people, but I can only speak for myself, right? The rules of hooks are very, very important. And now it's more important because finally, I'm super happy about this. Finally, people are now forced to actually follow these rules. And there you have it. I think this video has been long enough, but I hope that it's been comprehensive. This is the complete guide to modern React in 2025. Here you have all of the things that you now need to kind of learn about and be curious about and get familiar with. And now you have a roadmap of things to do for this upcoming year and beyond. Now, I just want to say and really stress that you're not supposed to know everything and you're not supposed to feel overwhelmed or depressed that you don't know a bunch of these things. It all depends on where you are at in your React journey. If you're a junior developer, chances are you maybe only know about hooks and some very basic things. If you're more of a senior developer, you might know a lot more of these things. I don't expect you, and nobody expects you to know every single one of these things. Even I don't. I haven't played around with tense start, with conform. I haven't really played around that much with use action state, use and suspense even. And I have some experience with the compiler, but again, I'm not an expert, right? You're not supposed to be an expert. You're not supposed to know everything. You're supposed to use this as a guide and then slowly at your own pace, start learning about these things and becoming familiar with them. And that's what I'm going to do for this entire year. I kind of also made this guide for myself to kind of know the things that I'm lacking in knowledge, and I'm going going to go and look for that and find resources and like just start learning those things. And you should do the same, right? So I hope that you can calm down now, you cannot feel overwhelmed, and just enjoy the process, because ultimately it is all about the process. Once you learn about all of these things, honestly, life would be pretty boring because there's nothing new to learn. And so enjoy the journey, enjoy the fact that you have more things to learn, and just progress slowly at your pace. And now you have a very complete guide, a very complete overview, a roadmap of everything that you have to learn. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see more videos just like this one, and also because this is the first video on the channel and I really went hardcore on this one, make sure to leave this video a big thumbs up. You can also click here to subscribe, or you can click here to watch a different video of mine that YouTube seems to think that you're really going to enjoy. And with that being said, my name has been Darius Kozden. This is Kozden Solutions. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Ciao, ciao.